In this video, we will see how the Lightning Network uses the payment channels that we explained in the previous video. If you haven't seen that video, I recommend that you check it out before watching this one. The link is on the screen and in the description below. The bidirectional channel explained in the previous video only works between two parties, and it would be hard to create a channel between every single person you want to make payments to. The Lightning Network solves this by finding paths from one person to another through a series of open channels. Let's first look at a quick explanation of what we want to do. This is Alice and Carol. Alice wants to pay 1 Bitcoin to Carol, but she doesn't have a payment channel with her. Luckily for her, she has a payment channel with Bob, who also has a payment channel with Carol. Alice can use Bob to make payments to Carol without having a direct payment channel with her. Alice needs to ensure that she only pays Bob if he also pays Carol. To do this, she tells Carol to create a secret value. This is basically a private key that only Carol knows. She then tells Bob that if he knows Carol's secret value, he will get 1 Bitcoin. Bob then turns to Carol and tells her that she will get 1 Bitcoin if she gives him her secret value. Carol accepts this and Bob gets her secret value, which he can then give Alice and get 1 Bitcoin. In the end, Bob has not lost or gained any Bitcoins, but 1 Bitcoin has been transferred from Alice to Carol. Now, let's see how this can be done using the channels we talked about in the previous video. We know how the transactions usually look in the channel, but we need to make a small modification to this. Alice wants to pay Bob 1 Bitcoin, but she can't do it directly because she needs to make sure that Bob has paid Carol first. Let's assume that the current balance in the channel is 5 Bitcoin for Alice and 5 Bitcoin for Bob. They both create new secret keys like we've seen before. Alice then creates a new transaction sending 4 Bitcoins to herself, 5 Bitcoins to the special address we've seen before, and 1 Bitcoin to a new special address. This new address can be unlocked in 3 ways. Bob can unlock it himself, but only if he knows Carol's secret value. If Bob never gets Carol's value, we need some way for the Bitcoin to be refunded to Alice. We do this by allowing Alice to unlock the Bitcoin herself at a certain future date. This is a fixed date. It is not a number of blocks since the transaction was broadcast like we've seen before. In this case, we set the date to be 14 days or 2 weeks from the time this transaction is created. Bob needs to get Carol's secret value before this date if he wants the Bitcoin, otherwise Alice will take it. We also need a way for Alice to take all the Bitcoin if Bob decides to broadcast this transaction when it's not the latest transaction in the channel. So we will allow Alice to unlock this Bitcoin if she has Bob's secret key. Of course, for this to work we also need to make sure that Bob cannot immediately take the Bitcoin, so Bob needs to wait for 1000 blocks if he unlocks the Bitcoin using Carol's value. This is to ensure that Alice has enough time to take the Bitcoin if Bob tries to cheat, like we've seen in the previous video. Bob creates a similar transaction. He sends 5 Bitcoins to himself, 4 Bitcoins to the regular special address, and 1 Bitcoin to a new special address. This new special address can be unlocked by himself if he has Carol's value, or by Alice after a certain date, which is the same date as for Alice's transaction. The Bitcoin can also be unlocked by himself if he has Alice's secret key. For this to work, Alice also needs to wait for 1000 blocks to allow Bob enough time to take the Bitcoin using her secret key if she broadcasts this transaction when it's old. They then sign and exchange their transactions, and they also exchange their old secret keys to invalidate the previous transaction. In this case, we don't have any old secret keys. Now, we have a lot of options for every transaction and it might be a bit confusing, so let's go through what happens if Alice decides to sign and broadcast the transaction she got from Bob. Bob immediately gets his 5 Bitcoins. Since Bob doesn't know Alice's secret key, Alice will get her 4 Bitcoins after 1000 blocks. And if Bob can provide Carol's secret value, he can unlock 1 Bitcoin as well. However, if he can't do that before the date, then Alice can unlock this Bitcoin after waiting for 1000 blocks. Since Bob doesn't know Alice's secret key, he can't take the Bitcoin immediately. Let's see what happens if Bob decides to broadcast his transaction. Alice will get her 4 bitcoins immediately. Since Alice doesn't know Bob's secret key, Bob will get his 5 bitcoins after 1000 blocks. And if Bob can provide Carol's secret value, he will get 1 bitcoin after 1000 blocks. However, if he can't do that before the date, Alice can unlock this bitcoin. Since Alice doesn't know Bob's secret key, she can't take the bitcoin immediately. So, when Alice and Bob exchange these transactions, it is now up to Bob to get Carol's secret value if he wants to get the bitcoin. Bob turns to Carol and they create similar transactions between themselves. These transactions work in the same way as the ones between Alice and Bob, and you can pause the video to verify this if you want. Basically, the transactions say that Carol will get 1 bitcoin if she provides her secret value. It's important to know that if any of these transactions are broadcast and Carol uses her value to unlock the bitcoin, that value will be publicly shown to everyone. So when Carol uses her value to get a bitcoin from Bob, he will then automatically get the value and can use it to get a bitcoin from Alice. It's also important that the transactions between Bob and Carol have a date before the transactions between Alice and Bob. Otherwise, Carol could take Bob's bitcoin after the date has passed for Alice's transaction, and Bob would be unable to claim the bitcoin from Alice. Bob will then have lost 1 bitcoin and he doesn't want to take that risk. So using these transactions, Alice can pay Carol through Bob without anyone having to trust anyone else. However, in this scenario, all parties will have to broadcast their transactions before the date runs out to be sure that they get their bitcoin. This is a problem because it puts a restriction on how long a channel can be open. Luckily, there is a solution. When Bob gets Carol's value, he can simply show it to Alice. All parties then know that the value has been passed from Carol and that Bob can claim his bitcoin if he broadcasts the latest transaction. They can then agree to create a new transaction that updates the channel accordingly. For example, giving Alice 4 bitcoins and Bob 6 bitcoins in a regular transaction, and then invalidate the old one by exchanging their secret keys. In this way, no transactions have to be broadcast to the network. If Alice would try to broadcast the old transaction, she would lose all her bitcoin. Let's look at how that works. Alice signs and broadcasts her old transaction. Bob immediately gets his 5 bitcoins, but Alice has to wait for 1000 blocks before she can unlock her own. During this time, Bob can use Alice's secret key together with his signature to take Alice's bitcoins. Bob can also unlock the other output in the same way. This works because Alice needs to wait for 1000 blocks even if the date has passed. Notice that this works even if Bob doesn't know Carol's secret value. Of course, the same thing would happen if Bob tried to broadcast his old transaction, except then Alice would get all the bitcoin instead. Now, you might be thinking that Bob would get 1000 blocks of extra time after the date has passed to get Carol's value, since Alice has to wait for 1000 blocks before she can unlock the bitcoin. In this example, that is completely true. However, in the real implementation of the Lightning Network, things are coded a bit differently because of how the Bitcoin protocol works. What actually happens is that Alice can unlock this Bitcoin immediately after the date has passed. It is then sent to another multi-signature address. This new address cannot be unlocked by Carol's value, but Alice has to wait 1000 blocks before she can unlock the Bitcoin from this new address. During that time, Bob can take the Bitcoin from the new address if he has Alice's secret key. However, this is way outside the scope of this video, and if you want to know the exact details of this, I suggest reading the Lightning Network white paper, which I have linked in the description below. This has been an example with only 3 parties, but you can expand this to any number of parties you like. You can then imagine an entire network of people having channels open to each other, which allows anyone to pay anyone else by hopping from channel to channel. And it all happens outside of the blockchain, since almost nothing is broadcast. This is what the Lightning Network aims to become, a large network where people can pay each other through their channels without worrying about transaction fees or confirmation times. Thank you for watching this video. If you want to support my channel, you can donate any amount to the addresses shown on the screen. They are also available for copy-pasting in the description below. If you have any suggestions on topics you want me to cover, please write them in the comments. Thank you again for watching, and I will see you in the next video.